Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews. We're still looking at Hebrews chapter 6, verses 4 through 8. This is the passage that deals with the sin of apostasy. And we've seen that the author of Hebrews tells us that for the apostate, it is impossible to be brought back to repentance. And that's because apostasy is simply a rejection, a deliberate rejection of Jesus as the way of salvation. And obviously you can't walk the way of repentance if you've deliberately rejected Jesus, because he is the only way. So the question for us to consider today is simply this: is there any hope for the apostate? Is there any hope for the apostate that he might someday be saved? Obviously, the author of Hebrews considers this sin so extraordinarily serious. That's why the warning against it. And notice the comparison he makes to land. In verses 7 and 8, he says, "Land that drinks in the rain often falling on it, and that produces a crop useful to those for whom it is farmed, receives the blessing of God. But land that produces thorns and thistles is worthless and is in danger of being cursed. In the end, it will be burned." So it's obvious the land that produces thorns and thistles is a comparison to the life of the apostate. And so the apostate is in danger of being cursed and in the end being burned as final judgment. So our question is there any hope for the apostate? Now there are some who say, well, no, it's already said it's impossible to be brought back to repentance if you fall into apostasy. But I'm not sure that's the whole story. Perhaps it is possible if you turn away from apostasy. Now, as long as you are in apostasy, as long as you are rejecting the way of Jesus, then there's no chance of salvation. You've rejected the only way. But what if you turn from that? What if you turn from apostasy and turn back to Jesus? Is it possible to be saved? Well, Dr. Michael Heiser has had some teaching on this that really helped me. And he asked us to remember the story of Manasseh in the Old Testament, especially his story in 2 Chronicles chapter 33. Now, Manasseh was perhaps the most evil king, the most evil ruler that the land of Judah ever had. If there was ever someone in the Old Testament who was truly apostate, it was Manasseh. Notice what it says about him in the first part of chapter 33. It says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem for 55 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He followed the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He rebuilt the high places his father Hezekiah had demolished. He also erected altars to the Baals and the Asherah poles. He bowed down to all the starry host. He worshipped them. He built altars in the temple of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, "My name will remain forever." In both courts of the temple of the Lord, he built altars to the starry host. He sacrificed his children in the fire in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He practiced divination and witchcraft. He sought omens. He consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the eyes of the Lord. Manasseh turned completely away from the Lord. He was an apostate in the Old Testament. He worshiped Baal and Asherah. He worshiped the starry host. He even set up altars to those foreign pagan gods in the very temple of the Lord. He was an apostate. He had rejected the Lord as God of his life and had turned to pagan gods. And he asked Israel, the nation of Israel, to do the same. But what happened to Manasseh? Now, God brought the Assyrians against Israel. Manasseh was taken prisoner. But notice what happens. Verse 11. So the Lord brought against Israel the army commanders of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh prisoner, who put a hook in his nose, who bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon. In his distress, Manasseh sought the favor of the Lord his God. He humbled himself greatly before the God of his ancestors. And when he prayed to him, the Lord was moved by his entreaty and listened to his plea. And the Lord brought him back to Jerusalem and back to the kingdom of Judah. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord, he is God. Did you see that? Manasseh had been an apostate, but he repented. He turned away from apostasy and came back to the Lord, and the Lord restored him, and the Lord brought him back. And Manasseh knew that the Lord alone, he is God. Now this gives me hope. If Manasseh could turn away from his apostasy and be saved, as it seems he was, so can the apostates today. So there is hope for the apostate. Now, as long as you remain in your apostasy, as long as you reject the way of Jesus, there is no salvation. You've rejected the only way. But if you'll turn away from that, if the apostate will turn away from that evil decision he's made and turn back to the Lord, he can find the mercy and grace and salvation of the Lord. Manasseh did, and I think it is still possible for the apostate today. As long as you remain in the sin of apostasy, there is no salvation. But if you'll turn from that and turn back to the Lord, his mercy is great, as it was for Manasseh. And that is good news. Hope you join us tomorrow as we continue our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Hebrews.